The notarized letter was so thick, it bent as the mailman shoved it through my slot. At first, I thought it was some bureaucratic mistake, a bank promotion, maybe a tax form. But when I tore it open, the sharp smell of ink and paper cut right into me, and I froze on the threshold of my new apartment. It was signed, sealed, and countersigned, declaring that my lease, the one I had fought and saved for, had been superseded. And the name on the second page, his name, hit me like a brick to the chest. My mother's ex-husband, Richard. My ex-stepfather. The man who wasn't supposed to have anything to do with me anymore. Not after the divorce. Not after she passed away. Not after the years of silence. I dropped the letter onto the floor and felt as if the walls suddenly didn't belong to me anymore. The lease in my drawer, the boxes stacked in the hallway, the tiny victories I had imagined in this place. All of it suddenly fragile. How could he even touch this? Why would he? My phone buzzed with a reminder. Rent was due this week. The reminder mocked me, because now, according to this official-looking document, Richard claimed to have financial authority connected to this very apartment. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity, but my throat locked up instead. He had always been a shadow that loomed, cutting into every corner of what was supposed to be mine. But this, a notarized letter? It was as if he'd been watching for the exact moment I thought I'd finally cut free. I paced the empty living room. The paint still smelled new. The curtain rods were still bare. This was supposed to be the start of my independence. Instead, it already felt hijacked. How had he gained access? Whose signature did he use? My mom's old accounts? The way the letter was worded, so dry, so final, suggested planning, not a last-minute grab. He had plotted this. I bent down and reread the part that seared the most. As guarantor of the property and executor of standing financial responsibilities tied to the account formerly shared by the late Mrs. Hallberg, all lease terms are subject to my oversight. The words made me dizzy. My mother's name doesn't belong here, I thought. She was gone. She never would have wanted him involved in my roof, my life, my independence. But somehow, Richard had found a way to breathe his control back into my world. If you think this already sounds extreme, wait until you hear what I discovered when I tried to confront him. Because the letter wasn't the whole story. It was just the first blow in a war I never asked for. Shall I write the next chapter? I sat on the edge of my mattress, half unpacked, the letter trembling in my hand. The ink left marks on my fingertips, like proof that I hadn't imagined any of it. That lease was everything I had been working toward. I'd scraped together every cent from 2 jobs, swallowed my pride borrowing a little from a cousin, and moved in within days of signing. My savings account was nearly empty now, but at least I had my own space, or so I thought. Walking away wasn't an option. Where would I go? Back to my aunt's spare room, where every plate of food came with a reminder about pulling my weight. Back to sleeping in my car like I had during the worst nights after Mom's funeral? No. This apartment wasn't just a roof. It was survival. And that's exactly why Richard had chosen it. I knew him too well. He'd been out of our lives for nearly 4 years. But he had always understood leverage. When Mom was alive, he was the kind of man who knew how to lock down accounts with passwords nobody else remembered. The kind who forgot to hand over mail until late fees stacked up. The kind who made freedom feel conditional. So, of course, he would show up again, not with a phone call, not even with his smug smirk at the door, but with paperwork. That was his favorite weapon. My chest tightens even now when I think about how calculated it was. He had tied my new lease to an old joint account of Mom's, one I hadn't even realized was still active. Apparently, as her ex-husband, He'd manipulated some legal technicality to present himself as guarantor, and the landlord had gone along with it, notarization and all. The thought made me sick. This wasn't just him hovering at the edges of my life. This was him cutting into the one place I felt safe. And yet, people always said the same thing to me. Why don't you just ignore him? He's not your father. That's the easy answer when it's not your name on documents you thought you could trust. I considered calling my cousin, the one who helped me with that last loan, but shame nailed me to the bed. How could I explain that even after cutting cords, burying the past, and standing alone, Richard still had legal strings tangled around my neck? How could I admit that moving in wasn't really moving forward, not with his hand clamped invisibly on the lease? So instead, I sat there staring at the walls, tracing the cracks in the paint as if they might give me answers. Deep down, I knew what this meant. If I wanted this apartment, this life, I was going to have to fight him. And fights with Richard never stayed private. Because soon, the little things he had done over the years, the subtle sabotages and petty controls I once shrugged off, would come charging back into focus. And those seemingly minor invasions? They were only the opening whispers of something much darker. Shall I write the next chapter? The next morning, I kept pacing between the unopened boxes in my living room, unable to shake that letter from my mind. I made coffee, tried to steady myself, but my hands were trembling too much for the mug to stay steady. That's when the memories started crawling back, the dozens of tiny cruelties that I had once convinced myself were harmless. Like the night I came home from college break and found my mailbox empty. I thought it was strange, since I was waiting on a bank statement. He smiled, too broadly, and shrugged. Oh, it must have gotten misplaced. I'll check later. A week later, the statement finally appeared in my pile, unopened, but marked with a crease that only his large hands could have made. Now I wondered, had he always been tracking my finances, looking for leverage? Or the time utilities suddenly rose one month when I was still living at Mom's house. He accused me of being wasteful. I remember defending myself, nearly in tears, promising I'd turn off lights more often. But later, I realized he had switched the address for one of his business accounts to ours. His bills were merged with ours without me ever knowing. To him, it wasn't theft. It was teaching me responsibility. I let it slide back then, just like Mom did, too scared to make waves. Even after Mom left him, his little envies crept in. He called by accident about repairs at my old apartment when I was 23. As though he had inside information about my lease then too. He said it was good that I moved someplace affordable, then casually suggested I should keep him in the loop in case of emergencies. That phrase burned in my head now. In the loop. Richard always inserted himself through loops. Finance, paperwork, mailboxes. The invisible channels of power nobody else noticed until it was too late. Rereading the notarized letter, I realized how naive I'd been thinking those manipulations were in the past. He hadn't left them behind. He had been rehearsing. And now he had pulled the largest string yet. My lease, my savings, my independence. It almost felt scripted. Every accidental control move back then was a step leading here. And like always, the moment I flinched, he would flip it, telling me I was imagining things, that my distrust was cruel, that I should be grateful. I bristled just at the thought, anticipating his voice before he even spoke it. And sure enough, when I finally gathered the nerve to call the number listed on the bottom of the notarized copy, his number, he answered with that shallow calmness he'd always used, as if I were the unreasonable one. "Don't overreact," he said the moment I asked why he'd interfered with my lease. "I'm only making sure you don't get yourself into trouble you can't afford. You should thank me." That sentence lit a fire beneath my skin, because if there's one thing you should know about people like Richard, it's that gaslighting isn't just their reflex, it's their language. And this time, his performance was about to escalate far beyond a letter. Shall I write the next chapter? His voice in my ear that night was like sandpaper against an open wound. Calm, deliberate, dripping with superiority. You'd be out on the street without me stepping in. You can't imagine what landlords actually require. They'd eat you alive if I weren't protecting you. I remember staring at the ceiling, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles whitened. Protection? Is that what he called this? Hijacking my lease? Reducing me to some dependent child again? When I pushed back, when I said this was my apartment, my money, he sighed theatrically. You're so dramatic, Ava, always making enemies where none exist. Frankly, you should be grateful I even recognize you. Without that letter, you'd just be another applicant with no credit history worth mentioning. That line stung more than the rest because it wasn't even true. I'd worked 2 jobs, built myself back up after years of scraping. My credit was hard-earned. But facing Richard, truth had never been enough. His game was to distort reality until even witnesses doubted themselves. Stop interfering in my life, I snapped, heat rising in my throat. His reply was ice. You're welcome to leave the unit if you don't like my terms. But don't pretend you're independent. You never were. You never will be. Then he hung up. I sat in silence, listening to the hum of my fridge, which somehow felt louder than the rest of the world. The space around me, my boxes, my folded blankets, even the dumb IKEA lamp I had proudly assembled myself, suddenly felt borrowed, like I was squatting in a life that wasn't really mine. But here's what gnawed me most. I had no proof that he was bluffing. Paperwork like this carried weight. Landlords didn't care about stories of control and emotional manipulation. They cared about signatures, stamps, guarantees. Richard knew that, and he leaned into it like oxygen. That weekend, fate delivered exactly the humiliation he wanted. While I was moving in the last few boxes, he showed up unannounced. He always did, never texting first, because announcing yourself meant admitting someone else's boundaries mattered. He strode into the hallway, loud enough that neighbors peeked out of their doors. "This is cute, Ava," he said, his eyes scanning my new space like he was touring one of his old rentals. "But let's not pretend this is really yours. You're here because I'm on that lease. You can't afford this alone." His voice boomed down the hallway. A young couple carrying groceries actually stopped to stare. I felt myself shrink, shame crawling up my spine like fire ants. He wanted witnesses. He wanted to rewrite me as the helpless girl in need of his intervention. That was the moment it stopped being private. Richard had crossed a line, and now there were eyes on us. And once the neighbors had seen him stake his false claim to my home, I knew this wasn't some quiet feud anymore. And the worst part? They looked like they believed him. Shall I write the next chapter? I shut the door behind him that afternoon, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it right back open. The echo of his voice still rang down the hallway, so confident, so certain, as if the lease were his trophy to wave in public. I leaned against the doorframe, and that's when I noticed 3 different neighbors still glancing at my apartment door, whispering to each other. They'd seen it all, his swagger, his claim, and my silence. That humiliation burrowed deep. He'd turned my fight for independence into neighborhood gossip. Now, whenever someone passed me in the stairwell, their eyes lingered just a little too long, like they were curious, or worse, pitying. Richard wanted that. He lived for performance. Gaslighting didn't work as well in private anymore, not now that I was old enough to push back. So what did he do? He staged a show, And he got his audience. I knew what had to be my next step. Go straight to the landlord. I grabbed my worn folder with the signed lease inside, tucked under receipts and my deposit confirmation, and marched across the street to the property office. My chest was still pounding, but I told myself proof mattered. Paper mattered. Except when I sat down in that narrow little office, everything unraveled faster than I could have imagined. The landlord, Mr. Kessler, gave me the kind of sympathetic but distant look usually reserved for toddlers having tantrums in checkout lines. He skimmed my lease papers like he was humoring me. "I understand your concerns," he finally said, but legally, Mr. Halberg presented notarized documentation confirming his role as guarantor. That supersedes regular lease agreements. It actually secures your tenancy. Secures my tenancy? I wanted to laugh and scream all at once. What kind of security involves handing your independence over to a man who left your mother broken and who hadn't been part of your life for half a decade? "I didn't ask for him to be involved," I choked out. "I signed the lease myself. I pay the rent myself. His name being anywhere near this is manipulation, not protection." Mr. Kessler leaned back, crossing his arms. "I'm not here to manage family disputes. Legally, he has binding authority." That phrase shattered me. Binding authority. Suddenly, the notarized stamp held more weight than my own sweat and paychecks. It didn't matter that Richard hadn't paid a cent toward my deposit. It didn't matter that he wasn't family anymore. Not by law, not by heart. He'd found a loophole, and it had teeth. I left the office numb, my lease folder heavy in my arms, but feeling like nothing more than dead weight. When I got back to the apartment, the building felt smaller, darker. Even the kitchen light seemed dimmer. My independence wasn't just jeopardized. It had been quietly signed away without my consent. And yet, the seed of suspicion had already started to grow in my mind. Because if Richard was waving notarized papers around, there had to be a trail that might prove what he was really doing. I didn't have proof yet, but every manipulation he ever pulled had left some trace, and I wasn't about to lie down this time. What I discovered when I started digging into his supposed paperwork was darker than I ever imagined. Shall I write the next chapter? I waited until midnight to pull out every folder, envelope, and half-forgotten bank statement I had. The apartment was silent except for the ticking of the cheap wall clock, and with each tick, I felt the pressure mounting. Somewhere, buried in a tangle of papers, was the answer to how Richard had wormed his way back into my life. I started with Mom's old files. I hadn't opened them since the funeral. They carried too much weight, too much memory. But at the bottom of a dusty box marked Utilities and MISC, I found something that stopped my breath. A series of statements from the joint account Richard had shared with Mom. It was still active, despite her being gone over 3 years. And worse, it showed activity. Small, regular payments. Withdrawals timed like clockwork. My stomach rolled. He'd never shut it down, never really let her go. He'd been using her absence as a cover. I spread the papers across the floor, lit only by the amber glow of a lamp. And then I noticed it. Several wire transfers, not massive amounts, but enough to raise red flags. The recipient line had the landlord's name, Mr. Kessler. My landlord. My skin went cold. He hadn't just claimed he was a guarantor. He had literally funneled small payments into the landlord's account under Mom's name, making it look like he was financially responsible for me, for the apartment. Suddenly, the language in that notarized letter made sense. The guarantor of the property tied to the account formerly shared by the late Mrs. Halberg. He was using her money, her name, her absence, to justify shackling me. I sat back, my knees shaking. This wasn't guardianship. This wasn't protection. This was fraud cloaked in grief. A dead woman's account used to chain her daughter's independence. I wanted to scream, But instead, I snapped photos, one after another, my fingers trembling. Lining up the statements, the bank transfers, the notarized letter, it was all starting to look like a web. A carefully engineered fraud, built from grief and paperwork. The next morning, I confronted Mr. Kessler again, photos in hand. I laid them on the desk, watching his eyes shift. His jaw clenched when he saw his name on transfers dated weeks before I even signed my lease. "This isn't legal. You know it isn't," I told him, my voice breaking. "He's been bribing you with money that was never his." For a long silence, Mr. Kessler didn't answer. And then quietly, too quietly, he said, "If you want to challenge this, you're going to create a war you can't afford." That sentence terrified me more than Richard's arrogance, because it meant both men were entangled. But by the time I walked back to my apartment, the terror had hardened into resolve. I couldn't unsee what I had uncovered. I couldn't let my mother's name be Richard's tool any longer. And that's when the breaking point came. Because survival now meant confrontation. No more secrets. No more whispers. I had to decide, either cut and run or ignite the war on my own terms. Shall I write the next chapter? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling as the city lights flickered through the blinds. My phone buzzing every so often with reminders of bills I was already terrified I might not be able to pay. Mr. Kessler's words replayed over and over. A war you can't afford. Was that a threat? A warning? Or just his way of telling me to shut up and accept the arrangement Richard had built? By morning, the decision was clear in my chest. Heavy but solid. I wasn't going to leave. Leaving meant surrender. Meant letting Richard rewrite not only my present, but my mother's memory. This was my breaking point. My only choice now was to fight. I pulled every bit of evidence into a folder, neatly organized. Bank statements with Richard's unauthorized transfers, the notarized letter he'd waved like a victory flag, and my own lease with the deposit receipts I had scraped together. I even printed out screenshots of my text exchanges with the landlord's assistant, where it was clear I had handled the lease independently. I wanted more than emotion. I needed facts. Because with Richard, feelings became weapons. But paper evidence cut through his gaslighting. As I assembled the folder, I rehearsed everything I wanted to say out loud. At times, my voice cracked, anger breaking into tears, then hardening right back into fury. How do you prepare to stand against a man who had spent years teaching you to doubt yourself, to question your own reality? By now, I had learned the bitter truth. You don't wait for validation. You redraw the battlefield. I decided I would confront him face to face, but not alone. I would go directly to the landlord's office, summon him there, and expose everything with witnesses present. If Richard craved audience, I'd give him one, but this time with receipts in hand. That thought steadied me. For once, I would control the stage, but there was risk too. Big risk. If he retaliated, if the landlord refused to acknowledge the fraud, I could lose the apartment altogether, end up both homeless and broke. I imagined myself dragging boxes back to my car, my neighbors whispering about the girl whose apartment wasn't really hers. The humiliation would crush me. Yet the greater fear wasn't losing the apartment. It was losing myself. If I let him win now, then every boundary I set in the future would feel hollow, tainted by this one defeat. So I slid the folder into my bag, zipped it firmly, and whispered to myself what I wished Mom could have said. He doesn't own you. And that's when I picked up the phone and made the call. Richard answered, his voice smug even before I spoke. "So," he said, like he already knew, "are you done fighting me?" "No," I said. my hands shaking but my voice steady. "Meet me at Kessler's office tomorrow afternoon. We're going to clear this in front of him." There was a pause, then a low, mocking chuckle. "If that's what you need to feel brave, fine, but don't expect anyone to take your word over mine." I hung up before he could say more, the taste of fear sharp in my mouth. Tomorrow, the confrontation would happen. And for the first time, Richard wouldn't be the one holding all the cards. Shall I write the next chapter? The next afternoon, I got there early, clutching my folder so tightly I thought the edges might cut into my hands. Mr. Kessler's office smelled faintly of dust and old carpet cleaner. The blinds warped so the daylight cut in unevenly across his desk. My stomach twisted when I saw Richard's silhouette arrive outside. The unmistakable stride, the confidence like he owned the air around him. He entered without hesitation, gave the landlord a nod like they were old friends, then turned to me with a smirk that nearly made me shake. "Ava," he said slowly, loud enough for the receptionist in the hallway to hear, "I hope we can keep this civil. No need to embarrass yourself." Embarrass myself. That was his favorite phrase when I was younger, even when I hadn't done a thing wrong. But this time, I didn't glance at the floor or shrink back. I set the folder on the desk and snapped it open with a force that startled even me. "I'm not here to embarrass myself," I said. "I'm here to show proof of what you've done." Then, one by one, I laid out the statements. Bank transfers from Mom's old account, with Mr. Kessler's name highlighted. The notarized letter marked up against the dates of those transfers. Screenshots of my lease negotiation. Each sheet slapped down was a piece of the cage he'd built around me. And now the cage was turning into a net around him. Richard leaned back in his chair and laughed, low and dismissive. "You don't even understand what you're looking at. These are technicalities. You wouldn't have this apartment without me. It's called being responsible, something you never learned." I turned on him so sharply even Mr. Kessler flinched. "My mother's account doesn't belong to you anymore. She's gone, and you've been bleeding it dry to make yourself look like my savior. That's fraud. And you know it." For the first time, I saw his composure crack. Just barely, but enough. A twitch at the corner of his jaw, a narrowing of his eyes. He hadn't expected me to use his own weapon against him. Then came something I hadn't anticipated. A voice from the hallway. "She's right. We saw him last week." It was the young couple from my floor, the ones who had witnessed his public outbursts during my move-in. They must have overheard everything, because now they stepped inside, awkward but firm. He came into the building claiming ownership. He made it sound like she was living here only because of him. We didn't think much then, but seeing that paperwork, it makes sense now. Richard's face darkened, fury simmering under his skin. His whole tactic, keep everything private, spin the narrative, isolate me, was burning down right there in front of witnesses. Turning to Mr. Kessler, I pressed the final blow. "If this goes further, I will take these documents to a lawyer. If that means exposing your involvement too, I won't hesitate. The only path forward is my name on this lease, and his entirely removed." For the first time in months, I felt taller, stronger. Richard could laugh, sneer, twist words, but the facts were spread across the desk, undeniable in black and white. The silence that followed was heavy. And then, Mr. Kessler's voice, flat but resigned. "I'll have to review the documents in detail, but it does appear changes will need to be made." Finally, cracks forming in Richard's control. But confrontation is never the end with men like him. It's only the beginning of their retaliation. And that storm was coming quicker than I expected. Shall I write the next chapter? Richard's storm didn't wait even a day. That very evening, I heard the first knock on my door. Short, sharp, like he was chiseling at the wood. I didn't answer. My heart hammering, I just stood frozen in the living room, staring at the dull light seeping in from the hallway. Then came the voice, low, threatening, for me alone. "You think you've won something today? You've only humiliated yourself. Do you have any clue what you've set in motion?" I stayed silent, my back pressed against the wall. My fingers itched to dial the police, but I knew Richard thrived on escalation. If I called, he'd twist it. "See? She's unstable. She's hysterical. She can't handle real responsibility." It was the same narrative that had always trapped me. The knocking stopped. Silence. Then the sound of his shoes retreating down the hallway. But my phone buzzed immediately after. A text message from an unknown number. "Blocked ID. Hope you have some savings left. You're going to need it." I didn't sleep. I just sat at my desk with the folder of evidence still beside me. That was when reality dawned. Winning the confrontation in the office had cost me. He wasn't just embarrassed publicly. He was cornered. And cornered men find ways to strike back. Sure enough, within days, the fallout began. A letter from a debt collector appeared in my mailbox, addressed to me but clearly tied to accounts I never opened. Someone had submitted my name and social security number under joint applicant. My stomach flipped. Only one person had both access and malice enough. Then, even worse, I found out from my cousin that she'd received a call. Richard telling her I was spinning lies again, that I was wasting Mom's legacy, throwing accusations because I couldn't handle rejection. He was casting his version of events across every crack in our family web. So here I was, my lease still technically unstable, debt notices appearing out of nowhere, my family's opinion poisoned like they were his campaign audience. Winning on paper wasn't enough. He was trying to bankrupt me both financially and socially. I was close to breaking. But when I sat on the edge of my bed and whispered my mother's name, a fire lit inside me. What would she say if she saw him leeching off her account, strangling her daughter's chance at freedom? She hadn't left that marriage only to see me chained by the very same man. I decided I wouldn't just fight for the lease anymore. I'd go for every piece of evidence, every rotten transaction, expose each fraudulent step he'd taken on her account. Because at that point, the war wasn't about the apartment. It was about closing the door on him once and for all. But exposure meant risk. And risk meant I'd need to put everything, even the ugly family secrets, in front of people who could actually dismantle him. That's how I found myself staring down another appointment slip, this time at a lawyer's office. The stakes were no longer just private skirmishes in a hallway. They were about to become public record. Shall I write the next chapter? Walking into the lawyer's office felt like carrying a part of my childhood strapped to my chest. Heavy, suffocating, invisible. The building itself was plain, just glass doors and overwatered fake plants, nothing dramatic. But to me, it felt like a battlefield. The file in my bag wasn't just a folder. It was my mother's ghost, my independence, and Richard's hands still clawing at both. The attorney, Ms. Delgado, was younger than I expected, brisk but not unkind. She gestured for me to sit down, her desk a fortress of yellow pads and legal codes. "Tell me what's going on," she said simply. My throat tightened. How do you fold years of manipulation into one sentence? Instead, I slid the papers across to her. The bank statements, the notarized letter, the screenshots proving I'd handled the lease alone. I told her about the transfers from my mother's account to the landlord, Richard's unannounced appearances, the smear campaign spilling into my family. She studied each sheet carefully, brows furrowing as her pen tapped against her notebook. Finally, she said, "This isn't guardianship. This is financial exploitation. And it's built on fraudulent representation, which means if you press forward, you not only can strip him of involvement with the lease, you can hold him liable. The words hit me like sunlight through a crack. Liable. That meant he wasn't untouchable. It meant the game he'd been playing all these years had rules, and he'd broken them. But Ms. Delgado didn't sugarcoat it. You need to prepare for retaliation. Someone like this, he'll drag it into every corner he can find. He'll use your extended family. He'll weaponize your mother's memory, anything you've ever confided. Are you ready for that? I swallowed hard. Ready? No. But what was the alternative? To live under his thumb forever? I thought of my unpacked kitchen, the cheap silverware rattling in drawers. The first night I'd slept there feeling free. I wanted that freedom back more than I feared him. Yes, I said firmly. I'm ready. She nodded. Then we start with an injunction to remove his authority from the lease. Then we go after the misuse of your mother's account. But you'll need witnesses besides paperwork. That night, I went door to door in my own building. Something that terrified me almost as much as facing Richard. The young couple who had spoken up before didn't hesitate. They agreed to testify to his hallway outburst. Another neighbor, Mrs. Patel, quietly admitted she'd seen Richard rifling through the shared mailbox days before the notarized letter arrived. Piece by piece, his performance was unraveling. When I sat with all the evidence, papers, witnesses, timelines, one truth hardened in me. I wasn't crazy. He made me feel crazy. But reality was mine again. And that gave me the courage to plan the next step. The confrontation not in an office this time, but in a legal hearing. A space where his smirk would have to answer to evidence under oath. Still, as I lay awake that night, part of me trembled at the thought. What if he managed to twist even this? What if the system bent in his favor the way people so often had in the past? Those doubts gnawed at me, right up until the day of the confrontation came, and I walked into that hearing room with Richard already seated, staring at me with that same old predator's calm. Shall I write the next chapter? The hearing room was colder than I expected, not because of the air conditioning, but from the silence that pressed down on me as I opened the door. The walls were pale gray, the kind that erase any sense of warmth. And there, sitting smugly at the table across from where the lawyer guided me, was Richard. His suit wasn't expensive anymore, probably rented, but he wore it like shining armor, shoulders squared, jaw set in that expression he used to wear when Mom would beg him not to raise his voice at dinner. I sat down, Ms. Delgado's presence at my side grounding me. But when our eyes met, Richard smiled. That smile carried years of history. I know how to unmake you. The hearing began with procedural questions, the kind that feel dry and harmless until suddenly they're not. The judge asked why Richard had inserted himself into the lease. His answer flowed like syrup. I merely stepped in to ensure Ava's housing security. She's my stepdaughter, and I couldn't stand by while she made impulsive financial choices. Stepdaughter. That word slammed into me like a betrayal by language itself. He wasn't my stepfather anymore. The divorce had shredded those ties. But he leaned into it, wrapping himself in fake loyalty. He twisted the narrative of control into parental concern. I gripped my folder so hard my fingertips ached. Ms. Delgado gave me a small nod. My turn. When I handed over the bank statements showing transfers from my mother's account to the landlord, the entire room shifted. Even the judge leaned forward. Pages rustled with significance. This demonstrates unauthorized activity, Ms. Delgado explained. Funds drawn from a deceased woman's account, used to establish fraudulent financial standing. This is not guardianship. This is exploitation. Richard scoffed audibly. You think I need her money? Please. These statements don't prove intent. They show I was keeping the account active for household obligations already tied to it. Household obligations? I cut in, my voice cracking but steadying as it filled the sterile room. There is no household. My mother has been gone 3 years. The only obligation you have is to your own debts. And you dragged her name, and mine, into them. The silence that followed was brutal. For a moment I felt panic, like maybe I'd spoken too emotionally. Maybe I had handed him fuel. But then Mrs. Patel, my neighbor, stood nervously in the back. She raised her hand as though we were back in school. I saw him taking letters from the mailbox for this unit. More than once. I thought it was odd. That was the crack spreading wider, the first witness voice against him. Then the young couple chimed in too, confirming his humiliating outburst in the hallway. Their words echoed everything I'd tried to explain. His false claims, his swagger in public, his insistence that he owned my place. For the first time, Richard faltered. His knee bounced under the table. His lawyer whispered hurriedly into his ear, but I saw the darkness rushing across his face. He couldn't spin this as easily. Not with other voices in the room, not with bank trails and witnesses. The judge leaned back, exhaling, eyes narrowing, as if measuring the weight of the evidence against the puffed-up man fidgeting in his chair. And I will never forget those words. On the matter of this lease, Richard Hallberg's name is to be removed entirely. Authority rests solely with Ms. Ava Hallberg, effective immediately. The relief swelled so fast in my chest I thought I might cry, but the moment was undercut by the look Richard shot me. Cold, silent, promising something. Because victory in that room didn't erase his debts. It didn't erase his need for control. And the kind of man he was. He wouldn't vanish quietly. What he did next blindsided me and nearly cost me everything I'd fought to win. Shall I write the next chapter?